My parents mistreated me during my childhood, so I left them. Now, when my grandfather has left me money, my parents want it as compensation for their parenting. I'm 32M and grew up in a household where money and appearances were everything. My parents were obsessed with material possessions and social status, but never cared about actually being good parents or creating a loving family environment. They were selfish and only focused on their own wants and needs. From my earliest memories, I felt like an afterthought in my own home. My parents' relationship was chaotic at best. They'd have explosive arguments followed by extravagant makeup gifts to each other. I'd hide in my room during their fights, covering my ears to block out the shouting. When things were calm, they'd ignore each other and me. My mother came from old money but had been cut off by her family for reasons I never fully understood. She resented this and was determined to prove she could be even wealthier on her own. My father was from a working-class background and had a chip on his shoulder about it. He was always trying to show he belonged in high society. Together, they were a toxic combination of status-seeking and materialism. Growing up, I never had what I needed. My clothes were always old and worn out, because my parents thought spending money on kids' clothes was a waste. I rarely got new school supplies. I'd have to make do with leftover pencil stubs and half-used notebooks. We lived in a big house in an upscale neighborhood, but my room was basically empty except for a bed and a desk I found on the curb. Meanwhile, my parents constantly bought new cars, designer clothes, and went on expensive vacations, usually without me. I started working part-time jobs when I was 14, lying about my age to get hired. My first job was at a local grocery store stocking shelves after school and on weekends. By 16, I was working 30-plus hours a week while going to school full-time. I had jobs at fast food restaurants, as a gas station attendant, mowing lawns, anything I could find. My parents took most of my paychecks, claiming it was for rent and to teach me responsibility, but I knew they were just using me to fund their lifestyle. The rest of our family couldn't stand my parents. My mother's parents had disowned her years ago. My father's family, while not wealthy, were kind, hard-working people who were disgusted by how my parents behaved. My aunts, uncles, and cousins on both sides slowly cut contact over the years. Even my paternal grandparents, who lived nearby, rarely visited. I found out later it was because they couldn't bear to see how I was being treated. I have memories of birthdays where no one showed up because my parents hadn't bothered to invite anyone, or had actively discouraged people from coming because they didn't want to waste money on a kid's party. One year when I turned 12, I got up excited for my birthday, only to find the house empty. My parents had gone on a weekend trip and forgotten it was my birthday entirely. I spent the day alone, heating up a frozen dinner and watching TV. Christmases were no better. I'd get nothing, or maybe one small cheap gift, while my parents exchanged expensive jewelry, electronics, and designer items. One Christmas, when I was 9, I got a used coloring book with half the pages already colored, and a broken toy car my dad had found in his office. Meanwhile, my mom unwrapped a diamond necklace, and my dad got a new Rolex. I was often left home alone for days at a time, starting when I was about 12, so they could go on trips. They'd leave some money for pizza and tell me not to answer the door or phone. I'd spend these days in constant anxiety, jumping at every noise and worrying about what would happen if there was an emergency. School was a challenge, because my parents couldn't be bothered with any part of it. I had to forge their signatures on permission slips and report cards. Parent-teacher conferences would come and go without them showing up. When I needed help with homework, I was on my own. Despite this, I managed to do well in school. It was my escape in a way. Teachers were often the only adults who showed any interest in my well-being. There was never any physical abuse, but the emotional neglect was constant. My parents would criticize everything about me: my appearance, my interests, my friends. On the rare occasions I was allowed to have friends over, nothing was ever good enough. They'd compare me unfavorably to the children of their wealthy friends, asking why I couldn't be more like them. As soon as I turned 18, I left and never looked back. I'd been planning my escape for years, saving every penny I could hide from my parents. I put myself through college, working multiple jobs. It was hard, but still better than living with them. I went completely no contact, changed my number, moved across the country. The works. I heard through extended family that they barely noticed I was gone. Over the past 14 years, I've built a good life for myself. I have a successful career in software development, a modest but comfortable house, and some savings. All the things my parents prioritized, but I earned them honestly. I also have close friends who are like family to me. I've done a lot of work in therapy to process my childhood and learn to form healthy relationships. I thought I'd put all the drama with my parents behind me. Then last week, I got a call from my grandmother, my dad's mom. We hadn't spoken in years, but she'd managed to track me down. My grandfather had passed away recently. Apparently, he'd left me a significant inheritance. Trust fund he'd been putting money into for me since I was born. He must have seen how my parents were and wanted to make sure I'd be taken care of. I was touched that my grandfather had thought of me even though we weren't close. The inheritance isn't life-changing, but it's a nice nest egg that will help secure my future. I told my grandmother I was grateful, and we had a good conversation catching up after all these years. She filled me in on some family news and apologized for not doing more when I was younger. It was a bittersweet conversation, but overall positive. Somehow, my parents found out about the inheritance. Now they're blowing up my phone, demanding that I give them the money. They're saying I owe them for raising me and that they deserve compensation for being my parent. They're threatening to sue me if I don't hand it over. I'm furious. They were terrible parents who neglected and exploited me. Now they think they're entitled to money that my grandfather left specifically for me. No way. I told them to pound sand and block their numbers again, but I'm worried they might actually try to take legal action. Can they really sue me for this? Do I need to get a lawyer? I don't want to give them a penny, but I also don't want to get dragged into a long legal battle. Any advice on how to handle this would be appreciated. Update 1. Thanks for all the supportive comments on my last post. A lot has happened in the past couple of weeks, so I wanted to give an update. First, I took the advice many of you gave and consulted with a lawyer. He assured me that my parents have absolutely no legal claim to my inheritance. The trust was set up solely in my name by my grandfather, so it's 100% mine. My lawyer sent my parents a strongly worded cease and desist letter telling them to back off. Unfortunately, that didn't stop them. A few days after my lawyer sent the letter, I was served with actual lawsuit papers. My parents are suing me for parental support and trying to claim my inheritance as repayment for raising me. The lawsuit is full of lies about how they supposedly sacrificed everything for me and how ungrateful I am. Reading through their claims brought back a lot of painful memories I tried to forget, like the time when I was 10 and broke my arm falling off my bike. I'd been riding alone because my parents never taught me or bought me safety gear. When I came home crying, my mom yelled at me for interrupting her TV show. My parents refused to take me to the doctor because they had tickets to a concert that night. I ended up having to call my friend's mom to take me to the ER. My parents were furious about the medical bill and grounded me for a month for being careless. There were so many instances of neglect and emotional abuse, times they forgot to pick me up from school. I had to walk miles home. I remember one winter evening when I was 13, waiting outside the school for hours in the freezing cold. When I finally got home, blue-lipped and shivering, my parents were hosting a dinner party and told me to go to my room so I wouldn't bother the guests. The lawsuit also brought up memories of the screaming fights where they'd tell me I was worthless and they wished I'd never been born. Anytime I did something they didn't like, got a B on a test, forgot to do a chore, or even just expressed an opinion they disagreed with, it would trigger a lecture about how I was a disappointment and a burden. There was constant criticism about my appearance, my grades, everything. Nothing was ever good enough for them. I remember when I was 16, I saved up for months to buy a guitar. Music was my passion and my escape. The day I brought it home, my father smashed it to pieces, saying I was wasting my time on silly hobbies instead of focusing on getting into an Ivy League school. One particularly vivid memory their lawsuit brought up was my high school graduation. I worked so hard to get there, and I was so proud of myself. My parents showed up late and left early, barely acknowledging the achievement. They didn't even bother to take pictures. My mom said it was a waste of time and money, and my dad said it was just a formality. I was devastated. It was one of the few moments I really needed their support, and they didn't care. I'd been dealing with their neglect and abuse for so long. I had hoped that once I was out of their reach, I'd finally be free. But now they're dragging me back into their toxic world, and it's really taking a toll on my mental health. I've had to take time off work to deal with this lawsuit, and it's been incredibly stressful. I'm trying to stay strong and focus on my future, but it's hard not to feel overwhelmed and angry. I appreciate all the advice and support I've received. I'm determined not to let them win, and I'm going to fight this lawsuit with everything I've got. Keep you all updated as things progress. Thanks again for being there for me. Update 2. I wanted to share another update on the ongoing situation with my parents. After being served the lawsuit papers and experiencing the emotional turmoil from the false claims they made, I've been working closely with my lawyer. We filed a counterclaim for emotional distress and defamation, highlighting the lies and the ways my parents' actions have impacted my mental health and well-being. The legal battle has been exhausting, and it's taking a significant toll on me both emotionally and financially. Despite my efforts to focus on work and my personal life, the stress from this case is constant. I've had to take additional time off work, which has impacted my finances. Thankfully, my lawyer is confident that the case will be resolved in my favor. My parents have shown no remorse and have continued their aggressive tactic, including attempting to contact my extended family to pressure them into supporting their claims. This has only alienated more people from their side, as my relatives have seen through their attempts to manipulate and exploit me. One small bit of good news is that the court has issued a temporary restraining order against my parents to prevent them from contacting me directly. This has been a huge relief. For the first time in months, I've had some peace and quiet, and it's allowed me to focus on healing and rebuilding my life. I've been spending time with friends and focusing on self-care, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. Despite the challenges, I'm determined to stay positive and keep moving forward. I appreciate all the support and encouragement I've received from everyone. Your words have been a source of strength during this difficult time. I'll continue to keep you updated as things progress. Final update. I'm relieved to share that the legal battle with my parents is finally over. The court ruled in my favor, dismissing their claims and awarding me damages for the emotional distress they caused. My parents' attempt to claim my inheritance and the lies they told about their parenting have been thoroughly exposed. I'm incredibly grateful for the support I received from my lawyer and all of you who offered encouragement and advice throughout this ordeal. The court's decision has provided some closure, but the process has been a long and painful journey. I'm now focused on moving forward and rebuilding my life. I've been working on my mental health and surrounding myself with positive influences. The experience has been deeply traumatic, but I'm determined to use this opportunity to create a better future for myself. I want to thank everyone who stood by me and supported me during this challenging time. Your kindness and understanding have made a huge difference in my life. I'm hopeful for a brighter future, and I'm looking forward to putting this chapter behind me. Story 2. Growing up, I always felt invisible. My parents, Jane and Richard, weren't abusive or overtly cruel, but their neglect cut just as deep. It was as if I was an afterthought, a decoration in their carefully curated lives. They were both successful, my mother a lawyer, my father an architect. They often spoke about their work, their travels, and the next big thing they were doing. But somehow, I never fit into those plans. It wasn't that they actively disliked me. They just didn't seem to notice me at all. My earliest memories are of being alone. Not physically, first. There were nannies and housekeepers bustling around, making sure I was fed and bathed. But emotionally, I was stranded. I remember looking up at my mother as she sat on the couch, sipping wine and reading a book, and wondering if she ever noticed how sad I was. But I quickly learned not to ask. The one time I did, I was about 5, I think. I had just drawn a picture at school, a family of 3, me, mom, and dad, holding hands under a bright sun. I showed it to her, eager for some sign of approval, but she barely glanced at it. "That's nice, darling," she said absently before returning to her book. I don't even think she saw it. That was the pattern for most of my childhood. No birthday parties, no family dinners. We were three people living separate lives under one roof. My parents had each other and their high-flying careers. I had silence. School became my escape. The one place where I could be more than just a ghost in someone's life. But even there, I felt disconnected. I watched other kids being picked up by their parents, going home to families who seemed to care. I envied them in a quiet, painful way that made me feel guilty. Was I wrong for wanting something I had never had? My birthdays were a painful reminder of just how little I mattered to them. I remember one year, it must have been my 10th birthday, when I had hoped, against all odds, that this year would be different. I had heard my parents whispering in the kitchen the week before, and I thought, just maybe, they were planning something for me. The anticipation made me restless, and I spent the night before barely able to sleep, fantasizing about waking up to balloons or a surprise breakfast. When I finally opened my eyes, the house was eerily quiet. I rushed downstairs, my heart pounding with hope. But the kitchen was empty. No banners, no cake, no gifts. Just a note on the counter, written in my mother's rushed handwriting. "We'll be back late. Order something for dinner. You're hungry." I stood there for what felt like an eternity. The silence in the house pressing in on me like a physical weight. I didn't cry. I just took the note and folded it neatly, placing it in my pocket as if it were some kind of proof. Reminder, this was my reality. I spent the day alone, watching TV and trying not to think about it. That evening, I didn't order anything for dinner. The thought of spending their money on pizza as if that could somehow make up for their absence felt hollow. Instead, I microwaved some leftover pasta and ate it in front of the TV, pretending like it was just another day. But inside, a piece of me was crumbling. By the time I reached my teenage years, I had learned to stop expecting anything from them. My birthdays became non-events. Days I spent like any other, quiet, lonely, and filled with a kind of numbness that had settled into my bones. I didn't talk to my parents about school, about friends, about my dreams, because I knew they didn't care. They were too busy with their lives, their work, their endless social event. I was just there. Christmases were another kind of pain. The holidays that were supposed to be about family and togetherness only highlighted how little of that I had. One Christmas, when I was around 12, my parents bought each other expensive gifts, a new watch for my father, a designer handbag for my mother. I sat there, waiting for something, anything to be handed to me. Eventually, they tossed me a gift bag with my name on it. Inside was a cheap scarf, something that still had the price tag attached. It wasn't the gift itself that hurt. It was the realization that they had barely thought about me at all. I wasn't important enough to deserve even a moment of their time. I remember staring out of the window that evening, watching snowflakes fall gently on the lawn, and feeling like I was on the outside of my own life, looking in. I started to retreat into myself more and more after that. If they weren't going to care about me, why should I care about them? It was a defense mechanism, I suppose, a way to protect myself from the sting of rejection. By high school, I had become fiercely independent. I got a part-time job at a local bookstore, saved up every penny I could, and spent most of my time away from home. My parents didn't notice. They didn't care where I was or what I was doing. As long as I wasn't causing any trouble, I was free to come and go as I pleased. It was liberating, in a way, but also deeply sad. I didn't have a family to answer to, no one to check in on me or ask how my day had been. I threw myself into my studies, knowing that academics were my ticket out of that house. I worked hard, earned top grades, and applied to colleges far away from home. I wanted to escape, to put as much distance between myself and my parents as possible. When I was accepted into a university on the other side of the country, I didn't even bother telling them in person. I left a note on the kitchen table the day I moved out, just like they had done so many times before. They didn't say goodbye, and they didn't call. College was a fresh start, but it wasn't easy. I had to work multiple jobs to support myself, waiting tables, tutoring, anything that would keep me afloat. There were days when I wondered if I'd make it, But the freedom I felt was worth every sleepless night. For the first time in my life, I was in control. I didn't have to rely on anyone but myself. And that, in a strange way, was empowering. I made friends in college, people who became like family to me. They didn't know the full extent of my background, but they could sense that I had come from a place of emotional neglect. It took me in, invited me to holiday gatherings, and for the first time, I experienced what it was like to feel included, feel like I mattered. After college, I got a job in software development. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work, and it paid the bills. I rented a small apartment in the city, and for the first time in my life, I had a space that was entirely mine. No more living under my parents' roof, no more feeling like an unwanted guest in my own home. I had carved out a life for myself, and that was something to be proud of. Years went by, and I had almost forgotten about my parents. We didn't speak, and I didn't reach out. They had their lives, and I had mine. I was fine with that, or so I thought. Then last week, I got a phone call from my grandmother, my dad's mother. We hadn't spoken in years. She called to tell me that my grandfather had passed away. I hadn't been close to him, but the news still hit me hard. He had always been kind in the few interactions we had, though we never had a real relationship. I was sad for the loss of the relationship we never got to have. What she told me next shocked me. My grandfather had left me an inheritance. It wasn't an astronomical amount, but it was enough to give me a sense of financial security. He had apparently been saving it for me for years, knowing the kind of upbringing I had endured. He had wanted to make sure I was taken care of. It was as if, all along, someone had been watching over me, even from a distance. I hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of relief, gratitude, and deep sadness for what could have been. My grandfather had cared. He had noticed what my parents hadn't, but now he was gone, and I would never get to thank him. A few days later, my parents found out about the inheritance. They called me for the first time in years, not to check on me or express any sort of emotion about my grandfather's death, but to demand the money. "We raised you," they said. "You owe us." Their words cut through me like a knife. After everything they had put me through, they had the audacity to think I owed them anything. I blocked their numbers, but the anxiety hasn't gone away. What if they try to take the money from me? Can they? I know they can't, legally, but emotionally, it feels like they're still trying to pull me back into their toxic world. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was a symbol of the love and care I never received from them. I refused to let them take that from me. Now, I'm left wondering, what do I do next? Should I get a lawyer, just in case? Or am I letting my fear of them hold too much power over me? After everything, I'm still seeking a sense of peace, a way to finally break free from the chains of my childhood and live a life that's truly mine.